Hi, friends. So, Jesus, he tells us to ask, seek, and knock in Matthew 7. Like, does that mean that we can ask him for anything and we're going to get it? We can seek for anything and with his help we'll find it? Or we're going to knock on any door and whatever's behind that door we're going to be able to get uh, simply because we've gone to Jesus for it and he's let us in that door? Yes and no. Uh, there's a lot that's going on here that I think we need to jump into. But before we jump into this, let's kind of use an illustration, right? And the illustration would be one of like just simply asking the question, um, when you were a young person, did you ever ask your parents for something? And of course the answer is yeah, of course. And did you get it? Well, sometimes. But were there some times when you ask and you didn't get what you want? And the answer is yeah. For some of us, probably more often than not, right? And I asked a group of young people that question, and they're like, yeah, sometimes my parents don't give me what I want. Well, why? Why do you think that they don't always give you what you want? And there were different responses like, well, they may not have the money to get you what you want. Or they may be teaching you a lesson that can't always get what you want. And one kid said, well, maybe it's not good for you. And your parents know that. And so they would not give you something that's not good for you. And I think that last one was hitting the nail on the head. Because if this is the way our parents are, when we ask of them, when we seek them, when we knock on their bedroom door and say, hey, mom, hey, dad, can you? And off we go with the ask. I think God is trying to help us to understand by an analogy how we can be in a relationship with him. Because, of course, we know that there are times that our parents are not always going to give us what we want. So why would we think that God should always give us what we want? It's a good question. Parents don't always know what's best for us, do they? I mean, I think any parent would agree to that after any short period of time. Most of the time, parents do know what's best for us, especially if they're of a right mind and right heart and they're living a right life. And they love their kids properly. They know, but not always. And our parents are finite. So they cannot see into the future. They cannot know if what they're going to give us or not give us is ultimately what's going to be best for us. But a lot of times they have a good sense of it. They have that intuition. They have that experience. They have that wisdom. And so sometimes it's yes and sometimes it's no. Well, how much more Jesus is talking about in Matthew 7 does your heavenly Father know? If our parents know how to give us, he says, good things, and they're not perfect and they're not all powerful and all knowing and so on, how much more so does the Heavenly Father know to give to us, who is all powerful, all knowing, all good, and wants our good, and is infinite in his ability to offer us assistance? Well, the answer is all the more, right? Or a million times more, or a billion times more. So I think a good way to understand this is just simply to ask the question, what if you could get everything that you want? What if we could go to God and ask him for whatever it is that we want? So Jesus goes on in Matthew 7, he says, what father among you would give a stone to your son when your son asks for a fish? Well, what if that's for us a Mercedes-Benz, right? And we just say to God, I really want the new series of Mercedes, whatever that is, right? And we think for us that's the fish, that's the big fish, and we want it. And we want God's help in order to obtain it. But what if God sees that not as a fish, but as a stone? And for whatever reasons, he sees out into the future, and he knows if he gives us that Mercedes or he gives us whatever, okay, he knows that that's like a stone and that's bad for us. Do you think that he's actually going to give that to us? And of course, the answer is no, he's not going to give that to us. But it's interesting because when we don't get what we want, then we often blame God because God didn't give me what I wanted. Even when what we want, we think is a good thing. In fact, when we're convinced that what we're asking for is a good thing. Let's look at this in another way. In another place, Jesus tells us a parable, and it's a very familiar parable. It's the parable of the prodigal son. Well, isn't this the story of a son, of a father, who wants it all and goes to the father and says, I want it all and I want it now? In fact, he has the audacity to basically say to the father, listen, I want half of my inheritance that you are going to leave me when you're dead. I want that now. Basically saying to the father, you're dead to me, so go ahead and give me half of what you're going to give me, because the other half was going to go to the other brother. And and then I'm out of here. And the father allows it. And I think that's the key, really, is that he allows the son to live out the pursuit of what the son wants. But what happens to that? The son takes and takes and takes, and then off he goes into the world to pursue what it is that he thinks is a good. Hanging out all the time with his friends, going through loose women, partying, having the house, having the life, whatever the life is. Now, this doesn't have to be us and to this extreme and so obviously bad, right? But we can spend a good deal of our lives pursuing the things that we want and that we think are good for us. And God's going to allow it. It's called freedom. And he gives us freedom to choose him and him who is the greatest good. But he also gives us the freedom to choose other goods that are not as good for us, that are lesser goods, and even can usurp or displace him as the greatest good. Because he loves us and he wants us to love him, and he knows that it's only through freedom that this is going to happen. And so he allows us to use our freedom and the goods that he ultimately gives us in this life. The inheritance. We inherit life from him. We inherit our breath. We inherit our health. We inherit so much from him that we would never have unless he first of all created us, loved us into being, and gave us so much for so many other people before we ever were 1 year old or 5 years old, and so on. The education, for instance, that we get, and the access to the things that we have. We don't earn any of these as children, for instance, and they ultimately find their place from God because he gives us this whole earth, right? All right. So you're getting my point. The prodigal son goes off and pursues what it is that he wants and he thinks is a good. But where he ends up is he's destitute, he's poor, he's alone, he feels isolated, he's sad, he's depressed, he's lost, and he thinks he doesn't have a father anymore. Or another way of saying it, he thinks that he's no longer worthy to be called a son. And isn't this what happens to us when we pursue what we want? We go after it with all the gusto, with all of our energy, with all of our effort, with all of our time. And we think very little from day to day really of God and the things of God and the good of who God is himself. And it's as if we say, listen, I get that pretty much everything I have in my life is really from you, God. I get that. So just go ahead and give me everything right now, and I'm going to go out and do what I want with it. And that's what we end up doing. And we end up forgetting that we have a father, don't we? And we end up forgetting that we have the dignity of being the sons and daughters of God. And worse than that, along the way, because of that, we feel isolated and we feel alone. And we struggle with depression and sadness and our purpose and our place in this world. And we feel as if we don't really have a home and we don't have a people. And all of that and worse, right? As we pursue the things of this world that are good or we think are good or we ultimately live as if they are better than the good of God. And this is the way we end up. And the terrible thing through all this is I can't tell you how many times as a priest I've had parishioners, young parishioners, like teenagers or young adults or mothers and fathers or older, who have lived just this life. And when I start asking questions about, just how they pursued what they wanted in life, along the way, they stopped going to Mass. Along the way, they stopped praying with any real regularity and anything really substantial other than here and there, maybe for a meal or as they're falling asleep at night, meaning giving God just a little of who they are. And they're wondering why they're depressed. And they're wondering why they're sad, and they're wondering why they can't find or remain in a fulfilling relationship with another person. And they wonder a lot of things out loud as they come to me as their pastor, and they're lost. And that's ultimately what lands them on my doorstep, is that they're lost. But along the way, in pursuing what they want, they had forgotten that they had a Father, and that Father loved them, and that the Father would allow them to go and pursue what it is that they want. Here's the point of what Jesus is teaching us. And the asking, the seeking, and the knocking is certainly in the parable of the prodigal son. In the midst of this deprivation, the prodigal son comes back to his senses. And he runs back to the father, who doesn't wait for the son. The father runs to the son. And the son just doesn't think that he's worthy of being a son. And he's just going to take the scraps off the table of the father. And the father says, no, put a ring on his finger, put a cloak on his back, put sandals on his feet, because this son was lost to me and now is found. And let's kill the fatted calf and let's have a celebration, because this son now recognizes and remembers that he has a father who has always loved him and always wants the good. And here's the thing. The good that the father offered the son always was the Father. And everything that the Father was and is able to give. And that's our God. And that's the life that he wants to offer us. And so he says, ask, seek, knock, and you will find. You'll find everything that you want. So when I ask the question, is this possible that we can ask and seek and knock and we'll get it all? And the answer is yes and no. If we're asking only for ourselves and for what we want, and seeking only for ourselves and what we want, and knocking and going through all the doors of life only for ourselves and what we want, then we will never find what it is that we want and what we need and what is our greatest good. And God may not answer those prayers by giving us precisely what we want, but he will allow us to go in our freedom and to seek and to ask and to knock in all kinds of places in this life, if only to at some point to come to our senses and realize that when we just pursue life for what we want, we're never going to find it. And then what we do is we come back to the Father and we say, what do you want? And we seek him. And we knock on the Father's door and ask him to let us into his home. And it's then that what we ask for, we will get from the Father. What we seek from him, he will give to us. What we knock on his door for, him who is in the house behind the door, he'll let us in. But sometimes it just takes that. But man, does it really have to wait till it gets to that point in our lives? And the answer is no. We can actually begin with asking the Father, what do you want? And whatever it is that you want, teach me to want. And then we set our hearts upon what the Father wants. And then guess what? We get everything that we want. And the same goes with seeking. My God, the world's the limit for seeking all the goods of the world, and all the Father really wants. And the reason why the Father set us in this world and gave us all the means that we have at our fingertips is in the hope that in all of these goods, we would find that He's the greatest good. And then we say, you're the greatest good. I seek you. And then He will give us so many other goods besides, but never the goods that will usurp Him, and never the goods that will leave us in poverty of Him, in all that at the deepest recesses we want, which is Him. And as we go through the world knocking on all kinds of doors for ourselves, He just wants us to say, stop. There's only one door that's going to give you everything. And it's a door that I stand behind. You know? And it's just like, being a parishioner, being a Christian, and knocking on the doors of a church. He's there. And everything that we want is there. But we spend so much of our time outside of those walls and outside of the Father's house, seeking and asking and knocking on all kinds of other doors. And He's just like, just knock on this door and you'll find me. You'll find me in my word. You'll find me in my Eucharist. You'll find me in the sacraments. You'll find me in virtue. You'll find me in holiness. You'll find me the greatest good. And then when you realize that, then I'll give you the greatest good. I'll give you myself. And not only that, it'll lead you to a life where I open the doors of heaven to you. And everything that you've ever wanted in life will be fulfilled. Because you'll find me. And for all of eternity, I will give you everything that you could have asked for or sought or knocked for. And for all of eternity. So yes, the answer is ask. Ask away of God. Seek and knock. But as you do that, always begin and end by, but whatever it is that you want, teach me, Lord, to want that. Whatever it is that you want me to seek, help me first to seek that. And whatever door it is you want me to go through, let me first go through that door. And I guarantee that so many other doors will follow. And the search will be unending of the adventures and the life and the gifts and the love and the friendships and the relationships that God will open to you through Him. And so many of the answers that you seek will be found in Him. So seek, ask, and knock. And you'll find everything that you've ever wanted. Until next time, see you later, friends.